The ranch lay quiet at the edge of the valley, where the cottonwoods leaned over the creek and the wind carried dust down from the red ridges. For 10 long years, only one man lived there. Folks in the nearby village called him a hard man, a man who spoke little, who kept his hat low and his rifle close, and who rode into town only when he had no choice. His land was wide, but his house was empty. Neighbors said his silence was not from pride, but from sorrow. A wife once kept his table warm and his bed shared, but she had been gone nearly as long as anyone could remember, leaving him with nothing but work and memory. He carried on alone. Seasons passed. Snow laid its weight across the barns, summer fires cracked through the grass, and every spring the calves came restless into the world. But through it all, the rancher lived in that lonely house, eating his suppers by lamplight and listening to coyotes cry. Some evenings, travelers swore they could see him sitting on the porch, rocking slow in the chair his wife once used, his eyes fixed on the horizon like he was waiting for someone who might never come back. Out in the village, the people pitied him, though they rarely said it to his face. Old women whispered prayers for him in church pews, young men studied the way he rode and worked, and shopkeepers watched his shadow cross their doors once or twice a month when he needed flour, salt, or kerosene. Children feared him at first, then grew to respect the silence that clung to him like his old leather coat. No man in town had been so steady in his grief, and no man had worked so hard to keep his ranch standing when most would have let the fields go. Yet time does not stop, even for sorrow. In the 10th year of his solitude, change began to stir, quiet as the breeze before a storm. It began the day a wagon rattled into the village carrying a woman who bore a striking resemblance to the rancher's late wife. She was her younger sister, the last of her family, and the sight of her sent whispers rolling through the townsfolk like wind across wheat. She was not a stranger, but neither had she been part of their lives for many years. Folks recalled that she had once been lively and strong-willed, a girl who turned heads in the dance hall and argued sharp as a knife when she believed she was right. But time had settled lines upon her face, and grief had hardened her eyes. She carried the look of someone who had seen her share of losses and was no longer afraid of them. When she asked after the rancher, the townsfolk hesitated. They warned her that he was not the same man he once had been. They told her that loneliness could make a heart stubborn and that he might not welcome company. But she did not flinch. She only said she had come because family should not be left to waste. Away in silence, she hitched her wagon horse and began the long road that curled through the cottonwoods and into the valley where the ranch house sat. The rancher saw her coming before she reached the gate. He had been mending a section of fence when the creak of wheels rose from the dust, and when he looked up, his breath caught in his chest. For a moment it was as if the years had fallen away, and he saw his wife riding toward him, her hair catching the light, her face shaped by memory. But then his eyes sharpened, and he knew it was not her, it could never be her. Yet the likeness was too strong to ignore. The woman stepped down from the wagon, her boots crunching on dry earth, and she faced him without hesitation. He removed his hat, though his words were few. He asked why she had come after so many years, why she had chosen now to stir a past better left resting. She told him plainly. She could no longer bear to see him live in shadows, and she meant to help him. The house was too large for one man, the work too heavy for one set of hands, and the nights too long to pass alone. At first, the rancher turned cold. He told her he needed no charity, no reminder of what he had lost. He had lived a decade in silence and could manage another. But her eyes did not turn away. She spoke with a quiet strength, saying she did not come out of pity nor for her own comfort, but because she believed her sister would have wanted it. She said there were bonds stronger than death, bonds that tied family together across years and miles, and she could not let those bonds be forgotten, Days passed, and the rancher found her still there. She moved into the house without waiting for his blessing, cleaning the rooms, stirring the hearth back to life, and setting a second plate on the table. The smell of cooking filled the air once more. The sound of another voice drifted across the porch, and the silence that had ruled for so long began to break apart like thin ice in spring. Yet peace did not come easily. For every kindness she offered, he felt the sting of memory. For every smile she gave, he saw the echo of the woman he had lost. Nights grew heavier than days, for the rancher knew that no matter how far he looked across the valley, he would not see his wife returning. And yet, here was her sister, standing in her place, refusing to let him fade into the dust. The people of the village began to wonder what would come of it. Some said the rancher would drive her away before winter set in. Others whispered that maybe this was the hand of fate, giving him a chance to heal, to let go of the past and embrace what still remained. But no one knew for sure, and even the rancher himself could not see where the road was leading. One evening, as the moon rose pale over the valley and the coyotes cried from the ridges, the rancher sat at his table with her across from him. Lamp flickered, shadows dancing on the walls, and a silence heavier than any before settled between them. She set down her fork and met his eyes, steady and unflinching. Then, with a voice low but certain, she told him there was one truth she could no longer keep to herself, something that would change the course of his lonely years and bind their lives together in ways neither of them had dared to imagine. But before the words could pass fully from her lips, the sound of a rider's horse broke through the night, hoofs pounding up the valley road, carrying news that would test them both before dawn. The sound of hooves drew nearer, fast and desperate, cutting through the night like a storm breaking. Loose? The rancher stood from his chair, his hand tightening around the backrest as the lamp shook with the tremor of the horse. The woman across the table did not flinch. Her eyes stayed on him, calm but unwavering, as if what she had been about to say carried more weight than anything outside those walls. Still, the pounding came closer, dust rising in the moonlight, and soon the rancher knew there would be no ignoring it. He stepped to the door and pulled it open. A lone rider came hard up the road, his hat bent low, his shoulders hunched forward, urging his horse faster. When he reached the porch, the animal nearly collapsed beneath him, sweat and dust thick across its hide. The rider swung down, boots hitting the dirt with a hollow thud, and looked at the rancher with eyes wide and dark in the lamplight. "Trouble?" the man rasped. Out past the ridge. He said little more, for his breath was short and his body near spent, but his words carried a weight the rancher understood. Trouble in that country meant more than one thing: raiders, cattle rustlers, or men desperate enough to take from others what they could not earn themselves. The rancher narrowed his eyes, his jaw tightening, though he gave no outward sign of fear. He only nodded once, and the rider, as though relieved by even that small gesture, staggered back toward his horse. Inside the house, the woman had risen from her chair. She stood by the hearth, the firelight catching in her hair, her hands folded tight against her dress. She had not heard the details, but she knew enough. Out there beyond the cottonwoods, the land was harsh and unforgiving, and it had taken more than its share of lives. She also knew the rancher would not turn his back when called. No matter how heavy the burden already on his heart, he stepped inside again, closing the door but leaving the night's chill pressing at the edges. His eyes met hers, and though neither spoke, the silence was thick with unspoken things. She wanted to repeat what she had begun to say before the rider came, but the moment had passed. He would not hear her now, not with danger riding the valley. She only nodded, steady, letting him know without words that she would remain when he returned. No matter how long it took, before dawn broke, the rancher had saddled his horse. He rode out across the land he had worked for a decade, past the fences he had built with his own hands, past the barn that stood because he refused to let it fall. Behind him, the house glowed faintly, one lamp still burning in the front room, where she kept watch. The valley stretched before him, vast and dark, the ridges rising like silent sentinels against the pale line of the coming day. As he rode, memories rose unbidden. He thought of his wife, the woman whose laughter had once filled the house he now left behind. He thought of the promise he had made her when they first came to the ranch, that no matter what hardships came, he would hold the land steady, he would not let it fall. And he had kept that promise, though it had cost him nearly everything. Now, with her sister in his home, the old wound had been torn open again, raw and unhealed. But he could not linger on the past. The writer's warning gnawed at him. Outlaws had been seen in these parts before, men who preyed on lonely homesteads and carried rifles sharper than their honor. Some said they came from the border country, where law was thin and life cheaper than bullets. Others claimed they were drifters, too wild to settle and too mean to work. Whatever their origin, they left ruin in their wake. The rancher urged his horse harder, climbing the ridge where the land dropped into a hollow. In the first gray light of morning, smoke rose faintly from beyond the hill. His stomach tightened. Where smoke rose, so too did loss. Back at the ranch, the woman walked the floor, listening for every sound the wind carried. She had not slept, and her eyes were heavy, but she kept her hands busy. She tended the fire, fed the stock, and kept the rooms in order, as though each task was a shield against fear. She thought of her sister, gone these 10 years, and of the man who carried that grief like a stone upon his chest. She thought too of the words she had not finished speaking, words that now weighed upon her tongue. She knew the village would soon hear of the trouble. By midday, wagons would creak down the road, neighbors would gather, and talk would rise in hushed tones. But she also knew that for now, the ranch stood silent, its fate tied to one man riding against whatever danger waited beyond the ridge. The day passed slow. The sun climbed high, burning away the mist, and still there was no sign of the rancher. The woman stepped to the porch, shading her eyes against the light, scanning the valley for dust or movement. None came. She clenched her hands against her skirts, steadying herself. She was no stranger to hardship. Life in those years had taught her that loss often came without warning, that one day could strip away what you held most dear. Yet she was not ready to let this land, or the man who guarded it, fall into the same fate. Toward evening, riders came from the village, 2 men, their faces drawn, their hats pulled low. They asked after the rancher, their voices tight, their eyes shifting toward the horizon. She told them he had gone before dawn, answering the call of a rider who brought word of trouble. The men exchanged looks, their silence louder than words. They said they had heard whispers in town, rumors of stolen cattle, of gunfire beyond the ridge, of men lying wounded. The woman's heart tightened, but her face did not falter. She asked them what they planned to do, and they admitted they did not know. The sheriff had few men at hand, the land was wide, and no one wished to meet the raiders head-on. She thanked them for coming, but her tone carried weight, and the men shifted uneasily. They left soon after, promising to return with news, though their eyes betrayed doubt. Night fell again, cool and restless. The woman lit the lamp once more, keeping vigil at the table where she had first spoken her truth. But now the house seemed different. Shadows crept deeper, and silence pressed harder. She could almost hear the echoes of her sister's laughter, the memories that tied her to this land as much as they tied the rancher. And she could not shake the thought that her presence here had stirred something larger than either of them, as if fate itself had been waiting for her return. Far off, across the valley, the rancher moved in silence. The smoke he had seen at dawn was the remains of a homestead burned, broken, and emptied. He searched through the ruins, his rifle close, his eyes sharp. Signs of struggle lay in the dirt, boot prints, wagon ruts, blood dark against the soil. He read them as a man reads scripture, his mind piecing together what had come. The outlaws had struck quick, leaving nothing but ruin, and they had gone north, toward the canyon where the land grew rough and wild. He followed the trail, though the weight of it pressed heavy on him. Each mark in the dirt told a story of lives torn apart, of neighbors left without shelter, of a valley that grew more dangerous with every passing season. And though he had lived alone for 10 years, he felt now a stirring in his chest, a reminder that he was not as empty as he had believed. There was someone waiting at his house, someone who carried a piece of the past he could never escape, someone who had looked him in the eye and refused to let him sink into silence. The night stretched long as he tracked the outlaws into the canyon, where shadows hid deeper than moonlight could reach. He knew it was no small thing he rode against, but he also knew the land, every turn and hollow, every ridge and stream. And he knew too that a man who had lived with grief for 10 years had little left to fear from death. Back at the ranch, the woman lay awake, listening to the coyotes howl from the ridges. Each cry seemed to echo the uncertainty hanging over the Kumpanahansamangju with the Paradi Anju Kako, the uncertainty echo, the uncertainty hanging over the uncertainty hanging over the Yangji Valley. She thought again of her unfinished words, of the truth she had carried across miles to share. She wondered if she would have the chance to speak them, or if the night would carry him away before dawn broke once more. And so the house stood in silence, the lamp burning low, the valley stretched wide and waiting. Somewhere in the canyon, the rancher faced the men who threatened his land, while in the home he had built with his wife, her sister weighed at her heart heavy with truth, her future bound to the man who might never return. The canyon was narrow, its walls steep and jagged, shadows folding into one another so thick a man could feel them pressing at his shoulders. The rancher guided his horse slowly, his rifle resting across his thighs, his eyes sharp for the smallest sign of movement. The trail of the outlaws was clear enough, a set of fresh tracks, careless in their speed, winding deeper into the gorge. He knew men like that didn't care who followed, for they trusted fear and numbers to shield them. But he also knew the land, every bend and crevice, and that gave him something they didn't. He dismounted where the canyon split and tied his horse beneath a cluster of cottonwoods. The animal shifted nervously, ears pricked to the sounds echoing through the stone walls. Somewhere ahead, a fire crackled faintly, though the outlaws had built it small, hiding the flame. The rancher crouched low, moving with the patience of a man who had hunted game on this land since boyhood. He came to a ridge of stone and peered over. Below he counted 6 men, their figures hunched in the firelight. Some cleaned rifles, others gnawed at strips of dried meat. Their horses were tied close, restless and thin. The men were hard-looking, their faces rough, their laughter sharp and mean. He studied them carefully, the way a wolf studies prey. Yet he knew he could not take them alone. Still, he lingered, watching, marking every detail, their numbers, their weapons, their habits. Then he slipped back into the dark, unseen. While he tracked the men in the canyon, the village stirred with fear. News spread quick, carried from porch to porch, that raiders had struck again. Families bolted doors, fathers kept rifles close, and mothers hushed their children. The sheriff, gray-bearded and weary, gathered what few men he could, but his voice carried more doubt than strength. He had seen too many troubles, and he knew these raiders were not a band to take lightly. Yet the people looked to him, for there was no one else. The woman at the ranch heard these whispers when she rode into town for supplies. Folks gathered near the general store, speaking in low tones, their faces tight. Some looked at her with curiosity, others with pity, for her presence still stirred talk. They asked if she had word from the rancher, but she shook her head. She carried herself steady, though inside her chest the worry grew heavier. She knew he was out there, alone against men who would kill without pause, and she wondered if that valley would soon echo with another loss she could not bear. When she returned to the ranch, she found two men waiting near the gate, neighbors from a spread farther down the valley. They were older, their clothes worn from years of dust and labor, but their eyes carried the weight of quiet courage. They told her plain that they could not sit idle while outlaws tore the valley apart. They asked if the rancher had gone to meet the threat, and when she confirmed it, they offered to keep watch over the homestead in his absence. She thanked them, though she felt the sting of helplessness. She was no stranger to hardship, but standing idle was harder than any labor. That night, she walked the rooms again, her steps echoing in the silence, the lamp casting long shadows. She paused by the rocker on the porch, the chair her sister once sat in, and lowered herself into it. The boards creaked softly beneath her weight. She looked across the valley, the moon pale over the ridges, and thought of the rancher alone. In the canyon, walking the line between survival and death. Back in that canyon, the rancher lay hidden among the stones, watching the outlaws settle. He had followed them for 2 nights, studying their movements, learning their habits. He saw that one man, broad-shouldered and mean-eyed, gave orders while the others obeyed. He saw, too, that their supplies were running low, their tempers short, and their greed sharper than their discipline. He knew these men were not bound by loyalty but by hunger, and hunger was a brittle rope. Still, he could not strike yet. To ride into them alone would be certain death, and to ride back for help might waste time the valley did not have. So he waited, patient as stone, watching and listening. He remembered his wife, the way she used to tell him that a man who waited long enough for his chance could turn the tide of any storm. Her voice seemed to whisper through the canyon, steadying his hand, though it had been gone for 10 long years. The woman at the ranch found herself caught between 2 worlds. In town, people whispered that she should not have come, that her presence stirred ghosts best left buried. Some said the rancher's sorrow had been his alone, and no sister could share in it. Others, softer in their speech, said maybe she was the only one who could reach him. She bore their words with calm, though at night she felt the weight of them pressing on her heart. She wondered if she had stepped onto a road she could not turn back from, a road that would bind her to his grief as tightly as to his land. One afternoon, a boy rode hard to the ranch, dust rising behind his pony. He carried word from the village. Another homestead had been hit, this time closer to town. Cattle stolen, barns burned, a man left beaten near to death. The raiders were moving fast and fear was spreading. She listened, her face pale but steady, and thanked the boy before sending him on. When he was gone, she stood long on the porch, gripping the rail until her knuckles whitened. Somewhere out there, the rancher hunted the very men who now closed. In on all they held dear. By the 3rd night in the canyon, the rancher's patience bore fruit. He overheard the outlaws speaking, their voices low but sharp. They planned to strike the village next, to ride in under darkness, take what they could, and vanish into the hills. His jaw tightened. He knew the village was not ready, not with its few rifles and weary sheriff. If the raiders struck, the people would fall. He could not let it happen. Yet still he was only one man. He knew he would have to ride back, gather what strength he could, and lead the valley against them. The thought burned like fire, for he had spent a decade in silence, a decade apart from the affairs of others. But the land was his too, and he could not let it fall while he still drew breath. At the ranch, the woman dreamed restless dreams. In them, she saw her sister's face, her voice calling across a wide plain, urging her forward. She woke with tears on her cheeks, the lamp still burning low, the valley outside quiet beneath the stars. She rose, wrapping her shawl close, and stood again at the porch rail. The night was still, yet heavy with something unseen, as if the valley itself held its breath. When the rancher finally turned his horse back toward home, dawn was breaking pale over the ridges. He rode hard, the dust rising behind him, the weight of his choice pressing on his shoulders. He knew he must tell the valley what he had seen, that the raiders would not stop until they had taken all. And he knew too that returning meant facing the woman who waited at his table, the one who carried words unfinished, words he both feared and longed to hear. As the sun climbed higher, the valley stirred once more. Smoke still rose from ruined homesteads, fear still whispered through the village, and the ranch stood steady against it all, waiting. The woman stepped from the porch as a speck of dust appeared far down the road, growing larger with every hoofbeat. Her heart tightened, for she did not yet know if it was hope riding toward her or another burden she was not ready to bear. The rancher's horse thundered down the valley road, the morning sun throwing long shadows across the land. Dust billowed in his wake, and his face was set like stone. He had seen what no one else yet knew, that the outlaws planned to strike the heart of the village itself. His mind worked with every hoofbeat, weighing what he must do. Alone, he was one man against 6. But with the valley warned, perhaps there was a chance. The only question was whether the people, weary and afraid, would stand and fight or scatter before the storm. At the ranch, the woman stepped down from the porch as she saw him coming. For a moment, her breath caught. She feared it was another rider carrying dark tidings. But as the shape grew clear, she knew it was him. Relief swept through her, but it was tempered by the sight of his grim face. He did not slow until he reined hard at the gate, dust clouding around them both. He swung down from the saddle, his boots striking the earth with finality, and looked her in the eye. "They're coming," he said, his voice low, gravel carrying through the still air. "The raiders mean to take the village." She did not flinch. Her hands tightened on her shawl, but her gaze stayed fixed on him. "Then you must tell them," she said. "They'll listen to you." He gave a hard shake of his head. I've kept to myself too long. They'll hear, but they may not follow. Then make them," she answered firm. "If you don't, no one will." For a moment, silence hung between them, heavier than the dust that still swirled. His eyes softened. Briefly, just enough to betray the weight he carried. Then he nodded once, sharp, and turned back to his horse. She reached for his arm as he moved past, her touch stopping him just a moment. He did not speak, but the look he gave her was enough a promise, or perhaps a farewell. Then he mounted again and rode hard toward the village. By midday, word had spread. The rancher stood in the square, his voice carrying over the gathered crowd. He told them what he had seen: the fire in the canyon, the 6 men hardened and mean, the plan to strike under cover of night. Faces in the crowd turned pale. Mothers clutched their children tighter, men glanced at one another with doubt in their eyes. The sheriff stood nearby, his hat low, his face drawn. 6 men, the rancher said. "That's all they are, 6. They're armed and cruel, but they ain't an army. Together, we can stop them. Apart, they'll take everything we got." A murmur rolled through the crowd. Some men nodded, others shook their heads. Fear gnawed at them, stronger than anger. The sheriff stepped forward, his voice slow and measured. "We've faced hard times before," he said. "We can face this too, but we'll need every man ready. There ain't no room for half-heartedness now." The rancher scanned the crowd, his eyes falling on each man in turn, letting silence settle heavy. "You've got families," he said. "Land, stock, futures worth keeping. If you let fear drive you, these men will strip it all away. But if you stand just once, together, they'll never come back." It was the blacksmith who first stepped forward, a burly man with soot still on his hands. He raised his hammer high. "I'll stand," he said. Then another, a farmer with calloused hands and tired eyes, lifted his rifle. "So will I." One by one, others joined until the murmur grew into a swell of voices. The tide had turned, but barely. That night, preparations began. Rifles were cleaned, lanterns filled, horses saddled. The people whispered their fears in dark corners, but they worked all the same. The rancher walked among them, offering few words but steadying each with his presence. In him, they saw a man who had faced sorrow for 10 years and still stood tall. If he could face death without flinching, then perhaps they could too. Back at the ranch, the woman watched the valley glow faintly with lantern light as men rode out to prepare. The house was quiet, but her thoughts were loud. She thought of her sister, gone too soon, and of the man who now bore the burden of defending not just land but lives. She thought too of the words she had yet to speak, the truth she carried like a stone in her chest. If the coming night went wrong, she might never have the chance. In the canyon, the raiders stirred. Their leader, broad and mean-eyed, tightened his saddle straps beneath the thin light of the moon. "We ride at midnight," he growled, his voice like gravel. The others grinned, their teeth sharp in the firelight. They smelled weakness in the valley, and hunger drove them forward. The hours dragged. The rancher gathered a small band to ride out ahead, to set watchfires on the ridges and lie in wait along the canyon road. He knew they could not outnumber the raiders, but they could outthink them. Every fence post, every gully, every stretch of mesquite became part of his plan. The sheriff stayed with the main body, guarding the heart of the village, while the rancher led his men to the dark edges where danger would strike first. The woman did not sleep. She sat on the porch, the lamp burning low beside her, her eyes fixed on the ridges. She felt the weight of the valley pressing in, as though every sound carried a warning. The coyotes cried again, sharp and mournful, and she pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders. In her heart, she prayed silently, not for herself, but for him, and for the people who now pinned their hope on his steadiness. As the night deepened, the outlaws rode. 6 shadows slipping through the canyon, their rifles gleaming faintly in the moonlight. They rode with confidence, their laughter low and cruel, their eyes fixed on the village ahead. They thought themselves hunters. They did not know they were already being watched. From the ridge, the rancher lay prone with his rifle, eyes fixed on the narrow trail below. His breath came slow and steady, his finger light on the trigger. Around him, the men he had gathered waited in silence, their faces pale but their grips firm. The air was heavy, the moments stretched tight. They could hear the outlaws' voices now. Drifting through the night, careless and sure, he raised his hand, signaling the men to hold. Not yet. Timing was everything. One shot too soon and the raiders would scatter, slipping into the dark. One shot too late and the village would burn. He thought of the house waiting in the valley, the woman who had refused to let him fade, the sister of the wife he had lost. He thought of her unfinished words, the truth still waiting to be spoken. Then he lowered his hand, and the night grew sharper. The outlaws drew closer, their horses' hooves striking sparks from the stone. The leader's voice carried, cruel and mocking. "We'll take 'em quick," he said. "They won't fight." His men laughed, but as they rounded the bend, the first shot cracked through the silence, sharp as thunder. A rider's hat flew into the dust and chaos broke loose. The canyon erupted in gunfire, sparks flashing in the dark, shouts echoing against the stone walls. Horses screamed, men cursed, and smoke thickened the air. The rancher's rifle spoke again and again, steady and unflinching. Around him, the men of the valley fought with desperate courage, holding their ground against the raiders' charge. But the fight was far from over. 6 men against a dozen might have been even, but these raiders were ruthless, hardened by hunger and lawlessness. They fought like wolves, and the night was their ally. Down in the valley, the woman heard the distant thunder of rifles, faint but clear. Her heart clenched. She rose from the porch, her hands trembling, her breath shallow. She wanted to ride, to see, to know, but she forced herself still. She knew her place was here, waiting, though the waiting tore at her like claws. The night deepened, the gunfire echoing, the cries of men and beasts rising. Smoke drifted along the ridges, lit faintly by muzzle flashes. The rancher crouched low. Reloading, his face streaked with dust and sweat. He knew this was only the beginning. The raiders would not turn back easily. They had come for blood, and they would take it if they could. As the gunfire raged, the village held its breath. Families, huddled in their homes, lamps extinguished, hearts pounding in the dark. Every shot carried the weight of their survival. Every cry of a man echoed through their bones, and at the heart of it, the rancher stood firm, his rifle steady, his will unbroken. But even he knew the night would not end without cost. The battle had only just begun, and the valley hung on a knife's edge, waiting to see which way the blade would fall. The night roared with the sound of rifles, shouts, and the pounding of horses. Smoke hung heavy in the canyon air, sharp with the bite of gunpowder. The rancher moved through it like a man carved from stone, steady and unyielding. Every shot he fired was measured, every move chosen with care. Around him, the valley men held their ground, fear written in their eyes but courage keeping them steady. They had no choice but to stand. Behind them lay their homes, their families, and their future. The outlaws fought with wild fury. Bear! Leader's voice cut through the chaos, urging them on, promising spoils and easy victory. But with each minute that passed, their confidence cracked. They had thought the valley soft, weak with fear. Instead, they found men willing to fight harder than hunger itself. One raider fell, thrown from his horse with a cry. Another stumbled, clutching his arm, his rifle clattering to the ground. The canyon rang with echoes of struggle, but slowly. The tide turned. The rancher's eyes stayed fixed on the leader, the broad man with a scar across his cheek and a sneer that never faltered. This was the heart of the threat, the one who bound the others with promises and fear. The rancher knew the fight would not end until that man was brought low. They met in the chaos, rifles empty, faces smeared with dust and sweat. The outlaw grinned through bloodied teeth and lunged, a knife flashing in the moonlight. The rancher caught his arm, the two men grappling in the dirt, their breath ragged, their strength pushed to its edge. Around them, shouts blurred into a storm, but in that moment, the world narrowed to the fight between two men. The struggle was brutal, neither giving an inch. The outlaw's blade sliced shallow across the rancher's sleeve, drawing blood, but the rancher did not falter. He had lived through loss and silence for 10 years, carrying grief like iron in his chest. Now that same weight gave him strength. With a final surge, he twisted the outlaw's arm, the knife falling to the dirt. The leader stumbled, and the rancher struck hard, sending him crashing into the ground. The other raiders, seeing their leader fall, faltered. Some turned to flee, spurring their horses back into the canyon. Others dropped their weapons, their courage broken. The men of the valley pressed forward, driving them back with shouts and gunfire until the canyon was empty but for silence and smoke. When it was over, the rancher stood bent, his chest heaving, his hands raw. The men around him gathered close, their faces pale but lit with something new hope. For the first time, they saw that the valley had stood against the storm and endured. The sheriff clapped the rancher's shoulder, his voice rough. "You did it," he said, but the rancher only shook his head. "We all did." The bodies of the fallen were buried on the edge of the canyon, the earth turned by tired hands. Number. One spoke much during the work. When the last stone was laid, the men mounted their horses and rode home, weary but alive. The valley was quiet again, the danger driven off. The rancher rode back slow, his body heavy with exhaustion. The moon had dipped low, and the first pale light of dawn was rising. Smoke still clung to his clothes, and his arm ached from the knife's cut. Yet he felt something he had not known in years, a sense that the land, scarred though it was, had been saved out at the ranch. The woman waited. She had not slept, her lamp burning through the night. When she heard the hoofbeats at last, her breath caught. She stepped onto the porch as he rode into the yard, his figure outlined against the early light. He swung down, his face drawn but alive. She rushed forward before she could stop herself, her hands gripping his arms, steadying him. For a moment, neither spoke. The silence between them carried more than words could hold. Finally, he said, "It's done. They're gone." She searched his eyes, seeing the weariness there, but also something steadier, something that had been buried deep for too long. She guided him inside, pressing him to sit while she fetched water and cloth. He let her tend the cut on his arm, his gaze never leaving her. When she finished, he reached for her hand, his calloused fingers rough against her skin. "You were right," he said quietly. They listened. They stood, her throat tightened. "Because of you." He shook his head, but she did not let go of his hand. For 10 years, he had carried grief like a shadow. Now in the quiet after the storm, she saw that shadow lift, just enough for light to break through. Days passed, and the valley slowly returned to life. Fences were mended, barns rebuilt, and the fields tilled once more. The people carried scars, but they carried pride too, for they had stood together and prevailed. The sheriff's voice no longer sounded weary, and men nodded to one another with respect in their eyes. The fear that had once haunted the village had been broken down at the ranch. Life shifted. The woman stayed, her presence no longer a question. Whispered among neighbors, but a fact accepted with quiet nods. She worked alongside him, mending, tending, steadying. The house no longer echoed with silence, but with the sound of two lives shared. There were still moments of quiet grief, his gaze lingering on the rocker where his wife once sat, her fingers brushing the locket she carried in memory. But the grief no longer stood between them. Instead, it bound them in understanding. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the valley gold, they sat on the porch together. The air was warm, the fields alive with the hum of crickets. She turned to him, her voice soft but steady. "When I came here, I carried something I meant to say, but I never finished." He looked at her, waiting. "I came because I couldn't let you stay alone forever," she said. "My sister wouldn't have wanted that. She loved you, and I loved her. But I also came because I care for you. Not as she did, but in my own way. I wanted you to know, whatever you choose." The words hung in the air, honest and bare. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then he reached across, taking her hand in his. His grip was firm, his voice low. "I know, and I don't want to be alone anymore." The silence that followed was not heavy but full, carrying with it the promise of something new. The rancher, who had lived 10 years in sorrow, had found reason to stand again, not only for the valley, but for himself. The seasons turned. The valley healed. The story of that night in the canyon became a tale told at firesides, a memory carried by those who had lived it. The rancher's name was spoken with respect, not only as a man of strength, but as a man who endured. And the ranch itself, once marked by silence, became a place of life again. The woman stayed, her place beside him no longer questioned. Together they tended the land, their days marked not by loss but by quiet companionship. At times she still felt her sister's presence in the wind across the porch and the laughter of children down the road. But instead of sorrow, it brought comfort, as though the past and present had finally found their peace. And so the story closed where it began, in the heart of the valley, on land carved from hardship and loss, but held steady by courage. The rancher, once alone, now carried more than grief. He carried hope and the promise of a future shaped not by shadows, but by the strength to endure and the choice to live again. The valley slept in peace, its people safe, its land steady. And in the quiet glow of evening, the rancher and the woman sat side by side, watching the horizon, their hands clasped. The long silence had ended. A new chapter had begun.